Across the burned-out streets of Japan, the war had no need to announce itself. It was etched into every broken window, every twisted beam of wood, every roof that gaped open to the sky. For months, sometimes years, the air raid sirens had been the soundtrack of night. Families learned to live by the pitch of their wail, the rising note that meant run, grab what you can, crowd into the shelter, pray that the next whistle from above belonged to a bomb meant for somewhere else. When the fires finally burned out and the bomber's drone faded from the sky, what remained were neighborhoods that no longer looked like neighborhoods at all. Streets had turned into corridors of rubble. Homes had become fragments, a standing wall here, a staircase leading to nothing there, a door still hanging on its hinges with nothing to close. For the civilians who emerged from cellars and dugouts, it felt less like waking up and more like stepping into someone else's nightmare. And somewhere above all this, far away in Tokyo radio rooms and army offices, words about honor and sacrifice continued to drift through the air. But down in the ruins, there was only smoke, ash, and the thin silhouettes of people who had run out of things to burn. They had been told over and over that if the Americans ever set foot on Japanese soil, they would be something worse than conquerors. They would be monsters. Mothers repeated the rumors in whispers to their children that American soldiers would kill without hesitation, that they would burn what little remained, that women would not be spared. Better to die, some said, than to fall into their hands. So when the war finally ended, first as a rumor, then as a stunned announcement, then as a strange quiet in the skies, the ruins did not suddenly fill with relief. Peace for many civilians arrived laced with dread, because now the monsters would surely come. In one coastal town, no different from dozens of others, the morning after the surrender began, like any other morning in the ruins. The sun rose over half-collapsed houses and twisted telephone poles. Smoke still curled from the remains of a warehouse that had been hit in the last raid. The smell of burned wood and wet earth mingled with the sharper scent of charred tatami mats. Families picked through debris with bare hands, searching for anything useful: a cooking pot, an unbroken bowl, a photograph that had somehow survived. Roofs were the first enemy. Without them, even a standing house was no house at all. The coming autumn winds would rush in. The winter rains would soak blankets and futons. A tear in the sky was a threat that never slept. Men climbed over beams and loose tiles, eyes scanning for anything that could be turned into shelter. Broken doors became makeshift roofs. Shutters were laid across gaps. Tarps, if anyone had them, were treasures. Children learned to help. They carried lighter pieces of wood, passed nails from one careful hand to another, held ladders steady with thin arms. They worked in silence as much as in words. When there is too much to mourn, speech becomes something extra you cannot afford. And then one morning, a low rumble rolled through the streets. Not the familiar growl of bombers, but something new. Engines, trucks. They came in a line, olive green against the grey of ash, their tires crunching over broken brick and shattered glass. On their sides, in white capital letters, was the word that had been painted as a curse in wartime posters: U.S. People froze where they stood. Hammers paused mid-swing. A plank of wood slipped from someone's fingers and hit the ground with a hollow crack. Men straightened their backs but did not step closer. Women pulled children behind them, hands gripping small shoulders. Old people watched from doorways, eyes narrowed, spines bent but unbroken. The trucks stopped in the middle of the street. Soldiers climbed down. They were younger than many had imagined. Some barely more than boys, their helmets slightly too large, their uniforms hanging loose. Others had faces hardened by long journeys through islands and jungles, lines of fatigue etched around their eyes. They looked around at the ruins with expressions that were hard to read, part curiosity, part shock, part something else that needed no translation. Pity. For a long moment, no one moved. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, one of the soldiers, an officer with a clipboard in his hand, spoke. His Japanese was halting, accented, clearly rehearsed. He pointed at the damaged houses, then at the trucks, then at the civilians. He said slowly, "We help. Houses. Roofs." The words sounded impossible, as if he had mispronounced them into a different meaning. Help? Houses? The civilians stared, unsure if they had heard correctly, or if this was some trick, some step on the path to the horrors they had been promised. The work began not with speeches, but with tools. From the backs of the trucks, soldiers brought out lumber, coils of rope, bundles of corrugated metal. There were boxes of nails, hammers, saws, and canvas sheets folded into neat squares. Some of the lumber was new, smelling of fresh-cut wood, sap still clinging to the grain. Other pieces were salvage planks, straightened and trimmed, good enough to hold off rain and wind. The first roof they chose to repair was not the largest or the most important. It was one that still had 3 standing walls, and an old woman sitting on the threshold, her hands folded over knees that trembled when she tried to stand. Her house had lost its roof in a single night, cut away by the blast of a bomb that had landed nearby. Her son had died in the army. Her grandchildren had been evacuated to the countryside, somewhere beyond the mountains. She had stayed. To leave the house would have been to lose everything. To stay meant living under the open sky, the stars visible through charred rafters. When the soldiers walked toward her house, she shrank back, pressing herself against the doorframe as if trying to disappear into the wood. One of them took off his helmet before he approached her. He bowed. Not deeply, not with the practiced grace of a Japanese greeting, but awkwardly, sincerely. He said, again in careful Japanese, "Roof, we fix." She did not answer. Her tongue felt heavy. This was not the script she had rehearsed in her fear. The soldiers did not wait for permission in words. They watched her eyes instead. When she finally gave the smallest of nods, they set to work. Ladders leaned against blackened beams. Hammers began to ring against nails, the sound sharp and rhythmic, echoing down the street. Neighbors gathered at a distance, watching. They had expected shouting, perhaps looting, maybe even torches. Instead, they saw Americans measuring timbers, passing tools to one another, steadying planks, while a fellow soldier hammered them into place. A few of the younger men from the town could not stop themselves. Work is a language older than fear. They stepped forward, hesitantly, and lifted the other end of a board, mimicking the soldiers' movements. One of the Americans smiled and nodded, gesturing how to hold it level. And so, in the shadow of burned-out walls, enemies began to build something together that had nothing to do with gunfire. Later, a schoolteacher in the town would write in her diary, "We heard the Americans had hands made for killing. Today, I saw those same hands lift our roof beam into place." The repairs spread, house by house. Some days it was a missing section of roof, patched with metal sheets, their dull shine catching the afternoon light. Other days, it was a door frame, straightened, a wall reinforced, a collapsed corner cleared of debris so that a family could once again step into the space they called home. The work was not perfect. The roofs they built were not the finely tiled structures that had stood before the war. They were rough, sometimes uneven, sometimes secured with whatever materials were available, but they kept out the rain, and that, after years of sleeping in shelters and cellars, felt like a miracle. Children watched from the edges of the rubble, eyes wide. Some had never seen foreigners before. For them, the word American had been a shape adults mouthed with anger or fear, not a person who sweated under the same sun, wiped dust from his face with the back of his hand, and smiled at them when they peeked around corners. One little boy stood so close that a soldier finally looked down and said something softly in English. The child did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was not the voice of a monster. The civilians were not naive. They knew this help did not erase the past. Many of the houses being patched up had been damaged by bombs dropped from planes with the same white star painted on their wings. The loss of fathers, brothers, and sons on distant battlefields did not vanish because a roof beam was straightened. Yet the work carved out a strange space where contradictory truths could stand side by side. The same nation that had shattered their streets from the sky was now sending men to climb their ladders and hand them nails. Some found this unbearable. A middle-aged man, whose shop had been reduced to cinders, refused at first to accept the help. When soldiers approached his property with planks and tools, he folded his arms and looked away. "Don't touch it," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "You burned it. Leave it." But as the days passed and rains began to gather in the clouds, his wife's health, already fragile, grew worse. The cold seeped into their temporary shelter every night. One morning, he found himself watching a nearby house where Americans and neighbors worked side by side, laughter punctuating the thud of hammers. The repaired roof was not beautiful, but it held steady under a sudden shower. He hesitated, then walked up to the officer with the clipboard. He did not bow. He simply said, "If you can spare any wood, the back wall, it leaks." The officer nodded and made a note. By evening, there were strangers in his crumbling shop, lifting beams, muttering measurements, tapping nails into place. He did not join them at first, standing off to the side, jaw clenched. But when one of the soldiers gestured that they needed another pair of hands to hold a support in place, he stepped forward almost against his own will. His fingers brushed rough American gloves as they positioned the beam. For a brief moment, no one spoke. the wood settled. The nail went in. The leak that had soaked his wife's bedding at night would soon be gone. That night, he lay awake longer than usual, listening not to the buzz of planes, but to the silence between raindrops. It was broken only by his wife's soft breathing, dry for the first time in weeks. In many towns, these scenes repeated themselves. American military engineers, men trained to build bridges and airfields under fire, now turned their skills toward roofs and walls. They cleared rubble from roads so that emergency wagons and carts could pass. They patched up clinics and school buildings. They showed civilians how to stretch tarps over broken rafters, how to anchor planks so they would not tear loose in the wind. Sometimes the help was formal, organized by occupation authorities. Sometimes it was informal, a sergeant deciding that his unit could spare a day to fix the worst damaged houses on their patrol route. A young woman from another town wrote in a notebook she had salvaged from her old school. I saw American soldiers carry lumber as if they were carpenters in our own village. They sweated like us, cursed the heat like us. Their uniforms looked heavy, but the beams they lifted looked heavier. Word spread faster than official announcements ever could. Neighbors visiting relatives in nearby towns came back not just with stories of surrender and new rules, but with tales that sounded almost unbelievable. That house near the shrine, Americans fixed the whole roof in one afternoon. The foreign soldiers helped carry tiles. They brought their own nails. Rumors had once painted the Americans as ravenous wolves. Now, new rumors competed with the old. They fixed my uncle's house. They shared their water. They told the children not to be afraid. Of course, not every interaction was gentle, and not every soldier was kind. Some looked at the ruins with hard, distant eyes, remembering friends who had never made it off the beaches or out of the jungle. They worked because it was their order, not because their hearts had softened. Others held on to their anger in quieter ways, a sharp word, a colder glance, a reluctance to accept the grateful bows offered by homeowners. Yet even their presence was different from what civilians had expected. There were rules, there were boundaries, there was discipline. The feared orgy of violence and vengeance never came. Instead, there were schedules pinned to makeshift notice boards, lists of streets where repairs would be attempted, guidelines for who would receive help first: the elderly, families with many children, homes near vital roads. A widow whose house stood near a vital bridge watched as a group of American soldiers finished bracing her damaged wall. They gathered their tools and prepared to leave. She stood in the doorway, hands twisting the edge of her apron. Finally, she said, in Japanese, "Why?" One of the younger soldiers paused. He did not understand the word, but he understood the question in her eyes. He looked around at the broken beams, the charred ground, the crumbling bridge beyond. Then he pointed at the repaired wall, patted it with his hand, and said a single word in broken Japanese he had learned: peace. She did not know whether to laugh or cry. The rebuilding work did more than patch wood and tile. It pulled civilians out of the paralysis that had followed the surrender. In the days immediately after the war, many had moved through the ruins like ghosts, unsure what was permitted, what future, if any, awaited them. Working beside the Americans, even in simple tasks like carrying debris or holding a ladder, brought back something that had been buried under years of fear, agency. They were no longer just targets in air raids or names on ration cards. They were people with hands that could build. One retired carpenter, his tools long since pawned for food, watched the American engineers measuring a cracked beam in a community hall. He stepped forward and shook his head. With gestures and a few broken words, he showed them a better way to brace the structure, tapping the wood here, pointing there, tracing angles in the dust with his finger. The Americans listened. They adjusted their plan. Soon, carpenter and soldiers were working side by side, sweat darkening both Japanese cotton and American khaki. At the end of the day, the hall still bore scars, but it stood. Its roof no longer sagged. Its walls no longer threatened to collapse at the slightest tremor. The carpenter sat on the steps outside, panting, his old muscles trembling. For the first time in months, his exhaustion came not from fear, but from work completed. He wrote later on a scrap of paper, "I thought my hands had lost their use." Today, they remembered. The children noticed everything. They watched the soldiers' strange habits, the way they chewed gum, drank from metal canteens, laughed loudly. They imitated their walk, copied snatches of English words, turned discarded ration tins into toys. When the Americans repaired a house, children clustered close enough to receive an occasional pat on the head or a piece of candy from a pocket. They were the first to cross the invisible line between enemy and curiosity. One girl drew a picture in the soot that coated the stone steps of her half-repaired home. She sketched a house with a roof made of straight lines and rectangles, not the curved tiles her grandparents had loved. Beside it, she drew a stick figure with a round head and long arms. When her mother asked who it was, she answered simply, "The soldier who fixed our roof." Not everyone approved of these shifting perceptions. In dark corners and private conversations, some muttered that accepting American help was a betrayal, that to allow the enemy to repair what they had destroyed was to weaken the anger that kept dignity alive. Yet anger, like hunger, could not fill empty stomachs or stop rain from falling through broken rafters. One older man, a former local official, spoke harshly when he saw a neighbor bow deeply to the departing soldiers. "Have you already forgotten who bombed us?" he demanded. His neighbor looked at him, then back at the house, now standing solid behind him. "I remember," he said quietly. "That is why I will not forget who helped us stand it back up." The contradiction did not resolve. It simply became part of daily life. The knowledge that gratitude and grief could live in the same chest, pressing against each other with every breath. As weeks turned into months, the most shocking part of the Americans' repairs was not that they had happened at all, but that they continued. This was not a single day of carefully staged charity, photographed for propaganda and then abandoned. It became routine. Convoys of trucks arrived with materials. Engineers checked on previous work, making sure roofs had not shifted, that supports were still firm. Civilians learned to anticipate the sound of engines, to gather tools and volunteers when dust began to rise from the road. The sight that had once frozen them with fear, columns of foreign vehicles entering their streets, became, if not comforting, then at least familiar. One diary, kept by a young mother who had lost her husband in the war, recorded the changing feeling with painful honesty. At first, I hid the children whenever the Americans came. We crouched behind the fallen wall and waited for them to leave. Today, when we heard the trucks, my son ran to get the hammer. I do not know what to tell him, she continued a few pages later. To hate, to be grateful, my heart does not know either. In time, the repairs the Americans began would be taken over by Japanese workers, by municipal crews, by families themselves, as materials slowly became available. The occupation authorities knew they could not rebuild a nation single-handedly. But the first months mattered. They were the months when every gesture, every decision, every nailed board carried more weight than its physical size. For civilians who had lived under a government that had asked for endless sacrifice and rewarded it with shortages, air raids, and silence, the sight of foreign soldiers using their strength to repair rather than destroy was jarring in a way that statistics could never capture. It was not that the Americans were saints or saviors. They were men carrying out orders in a war's aftermath, with their own scars and prejudices. Yet in those streets, on those rooftops, they became something else as well. Evidence that the world was more complicated than the posters and speeches had claimed. Years later, when the rubble had been cleared and new buildings rose where charred beams had once stood, the memory of those early repairs lingered in unexpected ways. Some houses still bore a single American plank, hidden beneath layers of later renovation, a patch of foreign lumber supporting a very Japanese roof. Children who had watched the soldiers work grew up and told their own children strange stories. That beam, an American carried it up the ladder when I was your age. Your grandmother was so scared of them. At first, she would not look, but when the rain came, she thanked them in a whisper when no one could hear. In interviews decades after the war, some civilians recalled not the roar of the bombers, though that sound never entirely left them, but the gentler noises that came afterwards, the thud of hammers, the creak of ladders, the murmur of voices in a foreign language working over their homes. One old woman summed it up in a sentence that had taken her most of a lifetime to find. They broke our houses from the sky, she said, and then, on the ground, they helped us stand them up again. I do not know how to forgive or how to condemn that. I only know it happened. For the Japanese civilians who lived through those days, shock did not come only from destruction. It came from a different kind of impact. The realization that the enemy's hands, once feared as instruments of ruin, could also lift beams, steady ladders, and pass nails. The roofs they rebuilt were not just structures of wood and tin. They were fragile shelters over a new, uncertain understanding that even after the worst of wars, humanity sometimes returns, first not in grand declarations, but in the simple act of repairing a stranger's broken home.